There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and to another episode of Zooming In, which is an occasional series where I have Zoom chats with bookish social media luminaries to talk about interesting articles online. And I would like to welcome for today's episode, Elisabeth of the fabulous BookTube channel, Bookins and Books, joining us from Ottawa. Hello, Elisabeth.
Hi, Shawn. Thank you for calling me a luminary.
Yes, well, I came up with that honorific in your honor. Isn't that a great way to describe Elisabeth?
I guess so. I'll take it.
Yes. We are here to talk about an article that was in the Globe and Mail, which is one of our national newspapers, about, it's kind of an editorial, a long-form article by a preeminent historian, a writer of popular history. Her name is Charlotte Gray, about the sorry state of affairs for writers of nonfiction in Canada. So there's only 7 of you who are still watching, and probably 4 of you are going to sign off when you find out that the topic is limited to Canada. But give us a chance to make our country and its books sound interesting, will ya? This I thought was a fascinating article. I have never read anything by Charlotte Gray. I just recently picked up one of her works of popular history, Flint and Feathers, which is the life and times of Pauline Johnson, and look forward to reading that someday. And she is not happy about where things are at, the prospects, the current state of affairs, if you're a writer of nonfiction, history or otherwise. And this article compares and contrasts how the glory days in the 70s and 80s compared to how bad things are. The advances publishers give have shrunk. A lot of stuff just isn't, you're not able to get it published. People aren't buying it, but yet she thinks, and she marshals some evidence to suggest that there is still an appetite for Canadian nonfiction. What did you think of the article, Elisabeth?
I thought it was interesting, for lack of another word. I wish I had more synonyms for that. It's an aspect I never really thought about. I sort of realized when I'm browsing for books, the bookstore, at the library, I realized that a lot of what we get is not specifically Canadian. It's American, it's British, it's a lot of things, but it's not necessarily Canadian. They are harder to find. So it was interesting to see one of the reasons behind it is that the writers do not get the advances that would enable them to write the books.
That's right. And also the other thing that I hadn't heard anything about recently was the Canada Council, which is an arts funding crown corporation or independent arm of the government. And apparently the money's dried up from them for
yes, and apparently they changed their rules and they are favoring memoirs or personal accounts over research or other types of nonfiction.
You and I were both struck by that point that Charlotte Gray makes in this article, which is that if you ain't writing memoirs, nobody's all that interested in publishing your work these days in Canada. I don't imagine that's only in Canada. Does that bear out in your expeditions to the local bookstore or in your otherwise involvement in Canadian books?
Yes, well, memoirs are everywhere. That is obviously, clearly, it jumps to your face whenever you walk into a bookstore that in the nonfiction section is the memoirs that are the ones put forward, whether it's celebrity memoirs or ordinary people's memoirs who write about ordinary events of everyday life, but it's memoirs and personal accounts, and it's very much focused towards experience nonfiction rather than research nonfiction.
Yes, this is the age of memoir. And everybody's got a story to tell, even if some of the rest of us don't think it's all that interesting to read. But the memoirs are very popular. And I had a prejudice against memoirs for many years in my in the early era of being on BookTube, and would rant about how much I didn't like memoirs and autobiographical writing. And I have read my way out of that prejudice. I quite enjoy a well-done memoir. Absolutely.
I'm still in that phase of not really liking memoirs, though I can recognize a good memoir when it's well done. But Yes, sometimes, well, I'm a judge for the BookTube Prize, which is hosted by booktubers, and the books are chosen by booktubers. And I judge nonfiction, and a quarter of the field every year is just memoirs, a quarter. And I don't think it's representative of what, well, perhaps it's representative of what is published, but I don't think it's representative of what could be published. Yeah.
So I think it's time to fess up and compare notes. I'm not much of a nonfiction reader to begin with, but I don't read, I read very, very little Canadian nonfiction. I would bracket Indigenous nonfiction off as a separate category, and most of the nonfiction I read, other than literary biography, and in fact, a much greater percentage of the nonfiction I read is Indigenous history or other nonfiction books. For Canada itself, almost none. How about you?
It's about the same number of almost none, particularly if we exclude the Indigenous readings. Because again, that's most of my Canadian nonfiction readings about Indigenous people, and Indigenous experience, memoirs. Yeah.
Charlotte Gray is 75. I looked her up on Wikipedia. She's a British born. She's been in Canada, as she said, for more than 4 decades. And she has written like the Pauline Johnson. For anybody who knows about Pauline Johnson, she was an Indigenous, what was she, a poet? Well, she was an Indigenous celebrity in the 19th century. I think you need to read the book to find out in what ways. I think she was in traveling shows, on stage, and I believe also a writer. But I thought Charlotte Gray, especially for someone of her generation, that her stance on how Canada is changing and how the Indigenous voices are coming to the center of the discourse was quite enlightened. But if this phenomenon that she's bemoaning is explainable, that Indigenous nonfiction is crowding it out, I'm in favor of that. But that's not what she's saying is the case.
No, that's not at all what she's saying. She's saying that there's an appetite for stories of more multicultural backgrounds, Indigenous stories, or stories of immigrants from all over the planet, or there's an appetite for stories that are more than just traditional Canadian history about explorers, about politicians, about hockey players, almost the cliches of Canada. Perhaps that's what the public is more or less interested to read about. Do we really need another book on Johnny McDonald? Do we really need another book on Wayne Gretzky? So in that sense, I can understand that publishers are perhaps reticent to publish books about that, but I don't think that's what authors want to write about. I think Canadian authors want to write about lesser known aspects of Canadian history or Canadian life, and they are finding that it's difficult to convince publishers that often are Americans, or perhaps there's a Canadian branch of an American publishing house.
National, yeah.
And it's hard to convince these foreigners that Canadian history is universal history. It's not just local history. It can be of interest outside the borders of Canada.
Well, so I want to open it up for people who are not Canadian. I want to hear from Canadians in the comment section, absolutely. But I also would love to hear from anybody who's still watching at minute 9 or whatever we're at, who's not Canadian. Do you read any Canadian nonfiction that's not about hockey or whatever? Like, I'm very curious. Maybe some people out there from the UK read more Canadian history or whatever than Elisabeth and I.
I do read a few. It's a couple, 2, 3, 4 a year, but compared to all the nonfiction that I read, it's perhaps 10%. So it's really not that much.
Just as a thought experiment, I'm going to spring this on you, and it could turn out to be a real thing, but this is really just a thought experiment. If you and I hosted a Canadian nonfiction readathon, do you think anybody would join in?
I think Lindy would join in, but beyond that...
And probably Jolene of Bookworm Adventure Girl, but...
Yes. I think that'd be the 4 of us, and perhaps one or two other people, but yeah.
So is part of this the fact that Canada is really boring?
It is certainly viewed as very boring. That probably is an opinion largely held by a lot of people.
Including a lot of Canadians. And I'm one, and I like to laugh about that, and make fun of Canada for being kind of boring, especially when you bracket off. It's only, for me, the only interesting thing about Canada is is that its reputation for being this beacon of light in the world, peacemaker, and non-racist utopia is complete and utter BS. And that's where Canada gets interesting for me. But we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But I find the Indigenous stuff, the Indigenous issues, Indigenous history is fascinating. So that's pretty much what I read.
Yeah.
Here's another, this is not a thought experiment, but here's a question for you. When you go to your favorite bookstore, do you go to the Canadian nonfiction section? Does your bookstore have a Canadian nonfiction section? I don't know if mine does.
Well, my new favorite bookstore, because my favorite bookstore has changed. My favorite bookstore used to be the big box bookstore, the Chapters on the corner of Rideau and Sussex. It was a wonderful store. It was huge. There were thousands and thousands of books. It was awesome. And last year, they decided to relocate across the street in the Rideau Center. It's about a quarter of the size it used to be, and the number of books has been reduced even more. It's now 10% of the books they used to have. So I don't like that store anymore. So I have a new favorite bookstore, and it's Perfect Books, which is a much smaller bookstore. It's an independent bookstore. And I don't think they have a Canadian section specifically, but they do have an Indigenous section. And the Canadian nonfiction is in evidence. It's not necessarily just a section for that, but it is put in evidence on table, or perhaps the books, rather than being placed like this, they're placed like this. So they do promote it.
And I think, for example, that there might, in my bookstore down the street, McNally Robinson's, that they might have a history section, and the Canadian would be mixed up with the American or whatever. I'm not sure, because I haven't, but we have a fabulous Indigenous section of the bookstore. I don't want to overly focus the discussion on history, even though the author, the Charlotte Gray, is a writer of popular history. But last year I read this personal history of Ireland, Fintan O'Toole's We Don't Know Ourselves, a personal history of Ireland since 1958. Did you end up reading this for the Booktube Prize?
Oh, I read it way before the Booktube Prize. Was my favorite read of last year.
Oh, it's definitely my favorite, one of my favorite nonfiction reads. Oh my God, I love this so much. And I remember when I wrapped it up on a Friday Reads video that I said, okay, so who in Canada is writing this kind of history? Irreverent, critical, insightful, but not in any way patriotic. I don't know of anyone. So is part of this issue that we don't have the nonfiction writers that are offering up something that is more along these lines? Because this was just incredible. And he did not pull his punches about the things that he didn't like about Ireland. And yet he didn't go overboard, so that he carried me through all that. You know, I didn't start to question his stance. But he was so passionate about exposing. It was like an history as expose. Who's writing that kind of history? I don't know of anybody.
I cannot come up with a name, because when we think Canadian history, the name that comes up is Pierre Berton. That's the classic name that comes up, and he sold thousands and thousands of copies of all of his books, and he's mentioned in the article. But it's a history that is, without necessarily being glorifying, it is meant to build a sense of a nation, I guess, which is perhaps something Canadians struggle with. What makes a Canadian different from an American? And sometimes these myth buildings help create a sense of a nation. So I don't know if as Canadians we feel solid on our feet enough to be able to tell a story like We Don't Know Ourselves, that doesn't pull any punches, that looks at reality with a bit of a distance and a bit of with a very critical eye.
I would wait in line for a book like that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Charlotte Gray does devote more attention to one recent work of Canadian nonfiction than any other, and that is a book that was one of my top reads of last year, Valley of the Birdtail, An Indian Reserve, a White Town, and the Road to Reconciliation by Andrew Stobo Sniderman and Douglas Sanderson, a.k.a. Amo Binashi. And I've had these gentlemen on my channel to talk about this book. It's a wonderful book about exactly what it says, and transformative read. Yeah. So I'm glad she singled that one out as kind of an exception to the rule or a sense of hope for the future, because this was a remarkable read.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a proof that good Canadian nonfiction can be written.
That's
and
right.
There's a market for it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Although, and what did she say? I think she said, let's see if I can find that. The sales were still not that great.
Well, then again, if we compare to Burton's figures, of course not.
That's right. Well, and so what can we do to change that? I guess all we can do, Elizabeth, is have a Canadian nonfiction readathon.
Yes.
Next July.
Sure.
I mean, I'm kind of joking, but we'll talk about it offline and see if we get at least 1.5 people leave a comment that they're interested, we might do it.
Yes.
Many years ago, in the 80s, I think it was, there was a contest by the much loved, esteemed Canadian magazine that's no longer with us called Saturday Night. I believe I'm remembering it correctly, that it was them that had the contest. Finish this phrase, as Canadian as ... And the winning entry, as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. So there you go. That's kind of, there's a social political thread from that winning entry to this sorry state of affairs with Canadian publishing. I thought we'd just quickly finish with a show and tell of a Canadian nonfiction book sitting on our shelves. Why don't you go first, Elizabeth?
Well, it's a book that I found just a couple of weeks ago at a used bookstore. And it is by a rather famous nonfiction writer, Ross King. And this is his book about the Group of Seven. So a group of painters after World War I who were basically the first to put Canadian art on the international scene.
That's right. And is it a recent book?
Depends what we call recent. I think it's from the early 2000s. It is from 2010. So 12 years old.
That sounds fascinating. And I didn't know of the existence of that book because I'm Canadian. So of course I'd never heard of it.
You know, I didn't know it existed either, because I know this author from other of his works, and all of his works that I've read so far are about the Italian Renaissance. I didn't know that he also wrote about Canadian artists, and I'm very happy to read
Canadian
that.
art. The one I grabbed off my shelf is a work of Western Canadian history, and it's kind of like a family memoir. But I don't know how broad he goes with Western Canadian history. It's called Lake of the Prairies by Warren Cariou, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. A Story of Belonging, and I guess it's a memoir, and it's set in the boreal Saskatchewan landscape and exploring, and I believe that the author has both Indigenous and settler heritage, and so exploring them both through this memoir. And I saw it referenced in another Saskatchewan memoir that I read and loved last year by my old prof, David Carpenter, called Courting Saskatchewan, and wanted to get my hands on it, and so now I have.
Yeah.
Well, have we made Canada sound fascinating? Have we accomplished our mission, Elizabeth?
I guess we'll know by the comments.
We'll know by the comments, and I'll check the stats later. I sure enjoyed it. Elizabeth, thanks so much.
You're very welcome.